All right. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining today's webinar, Auth Connect, Single Sign-On Made Easy. My name is Rachel, and I'm the moderator for today's event. Also got Matt Netkow here with me. He is the head of developer relations. And in addition, we've got Nick Hyatt, our lead product manager. So before passing it over to them for their presentation, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping topics. So first, today's webinar is being recorded. After the presentation, we're going to share a link so that you can watch the video on demand. Feel free to visit the content yourself or share it with your colleagues. And the presentation will be about 50 minutes. So after we're done, we're going to use the remaining time to answer any of your questions. During the event, you can submit questions in the question and answer chat box on your screen. So we'll get to that at the end of the presentation. I'm going to pass it over to Nick and Matt so they can start. Thanks a lot, guys.
Great, thank you, Rachel. And hey, everyone. Once again, I'm Matt Netkow, head of developer relations at Ionic. Thanks for joining us today. And a special guest today, we have Nick Hyatt. Hey, Nick.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
All right, let's get right to it. We've got an action-packed agenda today. So we're going to start with giving a primer about Ionic, our company, and our framework, all of our tools, everything that you may or may not be aware of today. Then we're really focused on security and authentication today. And we're going to start with a little bit of an authentication flow primer for devs new or veterans of security and implementing authentication in your apps, Ionic and mobile apps and beyond. Talk about a little bit about common authentication mistakes we've seen working with tons of different developers and companies over the years. And then next, we're going to introduce Ionic Auth Connect, our mobile security SDK that we're really excited to launch today. And I'll be giving a demo on my iOS device, really excited to show off how easy it is to add SSO into your Ionic apps. And last, we'll have a small mention about Identity Vault, which is another related security product of ours, and we'll have a bunch of time for Q&A at the end. So again, as Rachel mentioned, please leave your questions off in the sidebar. So a brief mention about Ionic, and you may have heard of us about the Ionic Framework in case you're not aware of us, but basically the Ionic Framework is a mobile-ready UI library containing over 100 open source and free components that web developers can use to develop really amazing mobile, desktop, PWAs, all kinds of different types of apps. And what's really great about this is because we're built on top of the web, our apps, any Ionic apps, can run within a web browser. So anywhere the web runs, your Ionic apps will work. And what this means for you at a high level is you're able to use and write one code base that works across all those different types of platforms. And we couple that typically with another app framework such as React, Vue, everything, any framework basically including vanilla JavaScript that you might want. And we kind of get a lot of questions about this, but is there any drawbacks in terms of accessing the full native experience that regular native apps get? And the answer is no. You have full access to native APIs as well, and that's with Cordova and Capacitor, which you may have heard of. Specifically, the other terminology for this is is a hybrid mobile app, right? So a brief look at what the hybrid architecture looks like. Again, you build your apps in the foundations of web technology, which is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And what we do is we use one or both open source projects, Cordova or Capacitor, and we bundle them into what are called native app shells. And essentially, at the end of the day, for you as a developer or your end users using your app on iOS and Android or Electron for desktop, it's a native app, right? The end user experience is still the same as a native app, and you can deploy it across all these different great platforms. What we're essentially doing is taking your web code, your Ionic app, and embedding a browser web view inside of that native app shell. And that's how your code executes and things. But again, at the end of the day, it's still a native app. Let's kind of shift gears a little bit now that we kind of have a brief introduction about Ionic and talk about app authentication. Typically really challenging, scenario for developers today.
Yeah, in particular, we're going to talk about implementing single sign-on workflows, which is a pretty common standard development practice these days. Just helps simplify companies who have multiple apps, web apps, native apps, anything across the board. You want to basically reuse your architecture as much as possible. So single sign-on is pretty prevalent in today's world.
Yep.
Basically, these diagrams are kind of lay out at a pretty high level of what the sort of flow generally looks like for SSO in a native application. So what you're going to have is your user opening up your native app over here. And what's going to happen is generally you have a service provider on the back end. It's either your own server that might be implementing running some software that helps implement the OpenID Connect spec. You might be using Microsoft Active Directory or AWS Cognito or Okta or Ping or Auth0 or any of these sort of authentication and identity service providers. And they all basically under the hood use the OpenID Connect spec. So what happens is you're gonna, in your app, you direct a user via browser to a URL on your server, right? And there's the OpenID Connect standard kind of basically has a set of URLs that are meant for login, registration, getting your token back. It's all based on getting a JWT back so that your users can authenticate against your APIs. So what happens is you open that browser. There's a complex handshake that goes on, which is in the second step. So basically, client opens up the browser window, passes in some information over to the server. The server presents the login page in your application. User puts in their username and password, email password combination. That's going to start this series of redirects that are going to end up coming back with a redirect to a URL in your application. We call it a custom scheme that your app has to be registered to accept, in which case the app will be able to parse the sort of query parameters passed back by the server and initiate a token request. And basically, in the end of the whole process, after this handshake back and forth, they're going to end up with a token, which they can then store somewhere securely on the device, and then they can use that token to authenticate against the application backend, so different services, APIs that the app might be using.
Yeah, pretty common type of flow, right? Authentication, but lots of details going underneath on the hood, especially for that handshake part.
Yeah, so a couple common mistakes we see when we're looking at this is we often see people storing their tokens unencrypted on the device. You can do that. It's not a best practice, just in case there's anything ever malicious happening in your app. It's really nice. Someone cracks the device or steals the device. It's nice to have all that stuff sitting encrypted, stored safely on the device, so you can feel confident that even if someone gains access to your user's device, they're not going to gain access to the tokens and then access to the systems you don't want them to have access to.
Right. And again, an access token in this kind of stage, when you're signed in as whatever user, depending on what your use case is, it could be fairly benign if it's more of a consumer level app, but if you're talking banks or other financial institution, that's, having access to that token is, puts you in full control of that user's account. So it's nothing to, really sneeze at there. So,
Sure. So another thing that is sort of a common mistake that's happened in the past is people storing sort of client secrets in the application source code. It's never really a good idea. With the OpenID Connect standard, really you don't really need any client secrets to communicate between these protocols. You kind of have a client ID, but the handshake makes it so that stuff is not necessary anymore. As far as implementing OAuth incorrectly goes, it's just a tricky flow to get right, and so trying to use whatever disparate technology to sort of accomplish the flow can be really tricky and very hard to debug.
Especially I'd add, as from personal experience, every provider seems to sneak in their own variation to it as well. So it's like the OAuth or OpenID spec to have to learn and understand, and then throw on each provider's details and kind of unique take on it.
It's true that every
not fun.
The OpenID Connect spec kind of lays out the groundwork, but every provider ends up doing a little bit of nuance that can drive you crazy for days and days trying to figure out what it is. So it drove us crazy when we were doing it. So so using out-of-date and insecure community plugins is another one. A lot of the plugins you'll find laying out there, they're written by a person at the time they needed to write them. They were great at the time and they do, but sometimes they've fallen by the wayside. They're not maintained. For example, there's a plugin for using the secure view controller, which you're supposed to use a secure browser to accomplish this. And that plugin, might in iOS, I think in the last 3 versions of iOS, they've had 3 new versions of which, web browser view you're supposed to use to accomplish this. So those things can get out of date quickly, and it's hard to keep track of, and it's a lot of work if you're trying to, you know, stay up to date on that stuff. And then I think the biggest, most common one I see is people using the in-app browser for these OAuth flows, which is not a best practice, and it's actually we can go into a little more detail with that one in particular, but.
And I've been guilty of this one myself too, in the past.
And I think back in the day it was sort of the standard, right? And these things evolve so quickly that it's, you know, it's
a good point.
Tricky. Yeah. But so basically the real problem with using an app browser is that it permits arbitrary JavaScript injection, which means there's a risk for stolen user data and passwords. So someone, when they're presenting a view in the in-app browser, right, they can add in additional JavaScript, which could allow somebody to read the input fields as the user's typing in, which is username, password, things like that. And because of that, you see places like Google in 2017 basically blocked all OAuth flows, OpenID Connect flows from embedded browsers. Now, you as an app developer might understand that I'm not going to maliciously inject like malicious JavaScript into my own application.
Of course.
But Google, Microsoft, AWS, Auth0, all these providers, they can't guarantee that that's the case. So they're taking measures to prevent and block these embedded browsers from being able to access the login flow. So for example, you can't do it with Google anymore using an embedded web browser. If you were to, you know, you might be able to do it with Microsoft or AWS today, but you may, you know, you implement the flow and it works today, it might not work tomorrow. So,
yeah, absolutely.
You know,
it's a big risk.
Yeah. So, but the in-app browser is good for loading, you know, external sites that are static content, terms and service pages you might have embedded in your application, anything like that. It's just not intended for these sort of OAuth flows.
Yeah. All right. Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, we have a solution for you. So we'd like to introduce today Ionic Auth Connect, which is our easiest way of integrating secure authentication into your Ionic apps. All of those concerns we just talked about are completely handled, addressed, and done in the most, you know, with security best practices in mind, and you as developers in mind for the developer experience that we'll show in a little bit in the demo, as well as that user experience as well. So what else is there to talk about there, Nick? On some great stuff here.
Yeah. So I mean, we like to, so we've created so that there's a single API basically working across all your providers, which is very nice. So there's not sort of you know, you're not tied to any particular vendor. The APIs look like login, register, log out, get token, set token, sort of your general, very generic open API that you can use with any sort of these service providers. And under the hood, they're gonna, you know, work differently depending on the provider slightly, but provide the same code base that you can use across all of your applications. We use the most up-to-date security practices. So those 3 different versions of the iOS view controller I was using that have changed with iOS 10, 11, 12, and who knows, probably 13 coming up next. We keep those up to date. So if your user's on iOS 13, we're going to use the right one for that. If they're on 12, we're going to use the right one. We fall back all the way, making sure you just don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. Support for Cordova and Capacitor, obviously, so that you get that native feel. You can use all your regular plugins you want. This is the same thing. And of course, obviously, it's built and supported by us.
Yeah, which means, of course, again, you know, latest and greatest security patches always applied, up-to-date documentation, all the kind of goodies you'd expect from a world-class product. So yeah, that's super exciting. And again, going back to our original diagram about the authentication handshake, right? That we kind of zoom that out now. So where does Auth Connect kind of fit into this, Nick?
Yeah. So basically, that big nasty diagram you see, that's you can just replace that with, you know, Ionic plugin install Auth Connect, and basically what's going to happen is you're gonna call that simple API I was talking about. You're gonna say, you know, authconnect.login, and this whole middle part of the screen is gonna happen for you because you're gonna configure it simply to your provider. So if you're using Active Directory or AWS, you write in some simple configuration file, and then your API stays identical. It's gonna open up the correct browsers for you. It's gonna redirect your users to the place, and at the end, what you're gonna get back from that login function is a token. And that token you can store securely. You can use to retrieve your data, and you don't have to worry about trying to program in a browser, which also you shouldn't be doing, but programming any browser, you don't have to worry about diving into native code. You just use their simple JavaScript API. It works across any of these providers. If you need to log into multiple providers, it's pretty easy to do that as well.
Yeah.
And it kind of just takes care of that headache.
Completely abstracted for you.
Yeah.
As a development team. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so some more about the benefits, as Nick was saying. We at the end of the day, from regardless of what size company you are or development team, protecting, especially in this day and age, we see all these data breaches in the news all the time. It's really heartbreaking, but it's a reality of today's world, right? We have to protect your user data and vis-a-vis your Ionic apps, right, or any of the mobile apps you build. So to drive this home, the reduction in risk of data theft cannot be understated here, right? It's such an important thing for your business and really your users, right? We're all consumers and users at the end of the day. So again, as Nick had said, saving time, because we're able to abstract this away into a great mobile security SDK, it's completely abstracted away for your developers. It allows you to save time and really just focus on your business concerns, right? There's plenty, every app needs authentication these days, and having to reinvent the wheel or worry about changing providers if you moved different clouds over time, which does happen, and all of that is taken care of for you. And as I mentioned, freedom to use any auth provider. So that's many of them, including AWS, Azure, Auth0, and beyond. And in general, just long-term peace of mind, knowing that Ionic has your back when it comes to keeping this up to date with the latest and greatest. As mobile operating systems change, as we said, iOS 13 is in beta now, right? That'll be coming soon. So as Nick had said, there's different. iOS and Apple is of course heavily security conscious in particular, and they love to change things up with each release. So you can trust Ionic to be on top of that kind of thing. So why don't you tell us more about some of the features, then we'll get into a demo here.
Yeah, so I think the key features to point out here are going to be that basically you have end-to-end OAuth sort of SSO via OpenID Connect support. So logging in, logging out, getting a token refresh. So once your user logs in, they don't have to log in every time. You'll get some. We use all the native components that are basically suggested by Apple. Meet App Store review guidelines that Apple puts out, which is changing from version to version. Meets the Google standards best practices. And you get some nice added benefits with it too. So if you're building something like internal apps across your company, right? Using some of these native components to do this authentication allows you, because they're secured and you're blocked from accessing any of the data, they can do things like shared cookie storage across them, so that essentially your user might log in on one of your internal apps and they don't have to log in like 500 times for all your other internal apps that they go into. Or if you're like Google and you have a whole suite of applications, right?
Oh, yeah.
You've probably experienced where you log into one Google app and you're magically logged into all your Google apps or whatever. So
as someone who's worked at a variety of size companies, once you get past a few people, you don't have to be a 100,000 person workforce. Even just a handful of people, that gets out of hand with all the applications and company apps and things we use today. So this is that you can't. I love that user experience of it. It's something that saves you multiple seconds times infinity almost every day. So that's a big deal.
Yeah, and then of course I talked about it a couple times, but just the ever-changing operating system versions, Android, iOS, releasing new versions of the operating system every year, deprecating old views you're supposed to use and updating for new ones, and changing their App Store guidelines. So all of that stuff kind of we take care of, right? Because we're handing this out at scale. So we're going to manage that. We're going to keep up to date with that stuff and keep it up to date for you.
Yeah, very nice. All right, well, let's actually dive into what this looks like. I'm really excited to give a quick demo here of Ionic Auth Connect. I'm going to take an Ionic app and add the Auth Connect plugin here. And we're going to look at, toggling between Auth0 and Azure in this case. And of course, we support more than that as well, but I think those are some really neat ones I'm excited to show off here. So let me pull this up. Okay, cool. So on the left here, as you can imagine, I have Visual Studio Code open with a sample demo app here on the right, and looks like texts are coming through. Sorry about that. And on the right, I have my iPhone tied in and connected to my device. And basically, what the idea behind this app is fairly straightforward, right? As a typical internal kind of company application, I'm an end user employee. I want to be able to log in and see my company directory. So I want to be able to message Nick and look up his email if I haven't connected with him before. But that's something we need to secure, right? We can't just publish that to the store and without some kind of login experience, right? So really, at a high level, I've already added the plugin, same kind of configuration. We're just going to kind of skip over that. Installing from npm as well as your typical capacitor and Cordova installation commands. And let's see. So a couple of things to mention, right? So on the left here, I have a route guard that I've implemented. This is an Angular Ionic 4 app, and as you might expect, right? We have a bunch of pages such as this company directory that we want to hook up to a route guard, which is fairly standard, implementation in Angular. And what I've got here is an authentication guard that's tied to that one particular page. The login page is our default experience. So when the app launches, we use the Ionic Auth Connect SDK to say, check, hey, is our user authenticated? And as we can see here on the right, they're not, so they're going to navigate to the root element, which is our login screen, right? So fairly straightforward implementation, kind of some extra magic on top of there. And really where things get interesting and is what I've done is I've created an authentication service class. So using programming best practices, I've pulled in and abstracted the Ionic Auth Connect SDK, right? And of course, and then we're injecting, you see it here, the Ionic Auth class. And of course, what this allows us to do is, just kind of a best practice for unit testing, dependency injection, etc. So really nothing out of the ordinary there. I've imported our Ionic Auth class. And if we kind of look down here, it's actually almost quite boring because we're abstracting in a good way, right? We're abstracting so much for you. We've got login, as Nick said, login, log out, registration, which takes you to whatever third-party cloud provider's registration page you're using, the ability to handle different, add your own logic beyond for callbacks and handling and retrieving user information, pretty much what you'd expect. I mean, in this case, we're just calling most of the Auth Connect SDK methods because oftentimes you don't need anything more, anything beyond that, right? And then lastly, what we're doing, and we need to kind of bootstrap this, and this is where it kind of gets interesting. We'll kind of show it in play. So as you would in a typical Angular app, the Ionic Auth Connect SDK, is bootstrapped, right? And we have just really one set of configuration options that we need to pass to it when the app launches. And what I'm going to do here is we're going to start with the Azure configuration, and then I'm going to use the Ionic CLI's live reload functionality to toggle that on the fly, which will be pretty cool. We'll see that in a second. But let's look at what the Azure configuration looks like, for example. So really, at the end of the day, besides installing the SDK and adding a little bit of boilerplate code to your app, this is pretty much it. We have an Ionic Auth Options object that I had to pass into the app module to bootstrap it. And sorry about that. Looks like I'm not fully off the grid as I thought I was. And we have to just provide client ID, redirect URIs, pretty much all the typical auth configurations that you would previously have set up in your third-party provider, like Auth0 or Azure in this case. So this is very basic examples. The only other thing to mention is we do give you control with the token storage provider. We do give you control, that keeps popping up. We do give you control over what kind of logic you want to run after the user's logged in and the access tokens retrieved, as well as the refresh token, all that kind of thing. Now I'm going to break what we have said previously, and you'll notice we are using local storage. Again, we don't recommend that beyond for a demo app, of course. We have a brief mention on another great SDK you can use to actually store that securely. So we'll talk about that. But as you say, I'm just basically retrieving and setting these two, and in a very simple promise kind of resolve. So let's go back to, we've got our Azure config. And I'm going to go onto my device here and sign in. Let's take a look at what this looks like. And so this is, of course, this is all handled by Microsoft in this case. This is the Azure login. And something to mention, I'm a big fan personally of 1Password. So what that's going to do is I'm just going to use that today, so I don't have to, and we'll just kind of sign in there. I don't have to expose all my passwords to you all today. So that's really handy, right? So I'm going to basically sign in. of course, we highly recommend using a password authentication system. So, your typical user flow, right? Username, password. Azure has a couple screens in this case, and we're going to hit sign in. All right, and look at that. So I've been seamlessly signed into the app, which is really cool. And just as kind of like a demo, I've got a really nice company directory here with all my information. And if we look up to the right, I've got my little avatar here, and you can see I'm signed into the app now with my email from Ionic, as well as the Microsoft Azure company instance, my Ionic instance, right? So I'm in, that's great. And all it took was a little bit of configuration. So I'm gonna log out now, and we'll see what that looks like. So each provider has their own different login, logout experience. This is kind of the Azure one. So with Microsoft, we actually have to specifically tap on the one that we want to sign out of, and there we go, signed out, can hit done. And again, I'm back to that login screen, right? So I'm no longer able, I'll kind of like move it around. I'm no longer able to access that directory, which is good, that's what we want. And as a really simple demo here, I'm gonna use and switch to Auth 0. We see down below, I've got live reload running on the device, and that should just take a moment here. Excellent, okay. So now when I come back over to my app and hit login, it should take me to the Auth 0 login config page. Look at that. So excellent. Again, all that config was previously set up. I'm not gonna bore you with those details, but as you can see, we can quickly toggle if we were trying this out, or wanted to even explore like a POC moving providers. There's, it really is simple. I'm gonna go ahead and use Google just for simplicity, but you see that, we've got all kinds of username login, social media login kind of things that you can configure on that side. And voila, this is really cool. I was able to log in, again, seamlessly. Going back to what Nick said about the shared cookie storage, I'd already previously logged in, of course, getting ready for this demo. And so it seamlessly passed me over, and I was able to skip because I'm using Google Login. You'll notice too, every provider has different data you can expose or share. And in this case, they actually have the avatar field that the Auth Connect SDK pulls in. So I got my beautiful face up there. I can tap on that now instead of the, kind of more robotic avatar. And there I've got it. I'm signed in again, slightly different email. And, now it's the Auth 0 instance. Yeah. So yeah. So again, very straightforward and really easy to get started with that and just add it to your app. Switch back over. All right. Okay. So let's talk about next let's talk about secure token storage, because again, as I was using in that demo app, don't do that. But we stored it in local storage to make things easy. But at the end of the day, we talked about these first few steps, right? Your user's logging in with your backend authentication system. That's the first 1, 2, 3 steps. And as we saw from our other diagrams in the demo, the authentication token will give you that session token, the access token, and refresh token. But the question is, where do you store that securely, right? And that's where kind of this next mention we wanted to talk about is there's local storage isn't the greatest option, and you have to store it somewhere on the device because you're going to be making repeated API calls to do all types of data management, right? And we want to be able to do that because if you have either a malicious person that gets access to your device or an app that steals that token, again, because of everything else we talked about, they could basically impersonate you, which is not so great. Yeah. So you want to tell us about Identity Vault that kind of takes care of this for us?
Yeah. So I think Identity Vault is probably, just Auth Connect and Identity Vault are kind of brother and sister plugins that go together pretty hand in hand. The Auth Connect is going to take care of that little left side, and the Identity Vault is basically what it's going to hand the token to, and you're going to be able to store that encrypted on the device. And it comes with, you can do a few things. There's a mode so you can store it just encrypted at rest, meaning you're going to encrypt the data. It's going to be stored at rest. The user doesn't have to really do anything to unlock it. The moment they open the app and get in, it'll come out. We use the keychain for storage, both Android and iOS. Again, similar plugin to this one, where the different versions of operating systems are going to have different standards for the keychain. So obviously we fall back and use appropriate measures based on the operating system that the user is on.
Yep.
And we basically encrypt the tokens, we store them securely on the device, and then allow you to retrieve them. It also has, besides just being able to store it encrypted at rest, it has built-in support for locking it behind biometrics. So if you want your user to use Face ID or Touch ID or the fingerprint scanner on Android, you can just enable that with a flag and lock your tokens behind that. If you want to send up a custom app PIN, you can do a similar thing. So that PIN will be used in the encryption process to store the data on the device, and allows you just to store it safely and securely on device while it's resting there. And then when you have your route guard checking it, it can just retrieve it from the encrypted device. So you don't have to leave it out and exposed as much as possible. You can just kind of store it safely away and only access it when you really need it.
Yeah, perfect. Very nice. All right, so to recap this here, as we, coming back to our user authentication and token flow, really combining these two excellent, powerful SDK solutions together, you've got your users logging in and then connecting to your authentication backend, typically whether your own or a third party. So we've got, Ionic Auth Connect providing secure authentication as a solution for that initial first few steps. And then from there, we've got Identity Vault providing secure storage, and combined, you've got a really end-to-end secure solution for the front end. So great stuff. All right, thank you very much, everyone. If you're interested in learning more about Ionic Auth Connect and Identity Vault, please reach out to sales@ionicframework.com or myself. My email and Twitter are there. And next, we're going to jump into some Q&A here. So let's get some of these questions up.
All right, hey guys. So if you haven't had a chance to already, please submit the questions in your question and answer box on your screen. Looks like we've had a few come in, so we can kick off with this question right here. Can this be used in older Ionic apps?
Yeah, Ionic 3. Yeah, absolutely. It's built to be compatible with both Cordova and Capacitor. So you're going to go through the same sort of Cordova installation process, and it's completely compatible with Ionic 3 and 4 apps.
Yeah, nice. Yep. Since it's more of a Cordova capacitor projects, it's really, that's what's kind of nice about it. It's agnostic from the web side of things. And that's also why we do that, right? Is it's abstracted and for not only going back to legacy projects but future ones as well. Nick, how about sign in with Apple ID? That's something that we should touch on. Yeah. What about support for that?
We plan to support it. We're already looking into it. They just announced it. What was that, last week, 2 weeks ago?
A couple weeks, yeah.
A couple weeks ago. So yeah, and the truth is, if you're using probably something like Auth0 or these other Connect providers, sounds like it's going to be required. So if you're doing any sort of third-party authentication, you're going to need to do your logging with Google, Facebook, etc. Which is some of the easy parts about like Microsoft and Auth0 is that you set up the SSO once and they allow you to provide all these different possible login endpoints.
Yeah, simple toggling of it too. Yeah, it's pretty. Yeah. So big props to all of them.
But if you're using that, you're gonna need to implement sign in with Apple ID, and of course we're already investigating and we'll be adding support for that. So I'm excited.
Nice.
To take care of that.
Yeah, so that'll be ready when that launches. Is that gonna be later this fall? Apple planning on that? You remember,
yeah, I don't know when the official.
They might not actually
even launch the official dates of when that would happen yet.
Oh, okay.
Maybe September. Yeah. I don't know. I can't remember.
Something like that. Yep. Let's see. Will this work with mobile, web, and desktop applications? Great question. So as we demonstrated for sure on mobile, as I just showed off iOS, but yeah, what about web support or desktop?
Yeah, so web support actually is getting, web support is on the list of things to do. It's actually pretty close to being done, but it will be coming to this as well. The flow, the nice thing is the flow for web is very similar to it is for native, minus some of the storage and native web views type of stuff, but the handshake is similar. So we fully plan to support the web PWA standards. If you're using Capacitor, it's really nice because you kind of just get to use your same app across all of these platforms very easily. And as far as desktop support, we're looking into the possibility for adding this for something like Windows support, but at the current moment, unless you're, if you're building, it depends. If you're building a web app and a desktop, you're probably not going to be able to use this at the moment.
All right, let's see what else. Can it support multiple users logging into the same app at the same time, or can the service support one at a time? Interesting question.
Yeah, well, really the plugin itself is it's not going to care whatsoever, right? So there's no reason you can't have multiple configured,
users,
providers for this. Yeah. So really what it would take is your application logic. So you might have to create, you had a simple wrapper that was called your auth service in your Angular thing. You might implement 2 auth services, one for each of your providers, and then you kind of have to, your route guard might be a little more complex in the logic of testing which one's logged in here and which one's logged in there and which routes are available to who. But really the plugin itself is pretty much just as pretty standard API, so you can kind of do whatever you want with it. As far as storage goes, you'll probably need to make sure that you're storing the tokens in 2 separate places, but by passing in a different interface, you should be able to accomplish that fairly easily. So
so it's more of an Ionic code concern, architecture concern versus the SDK itself.
The SDK is it's going to kind of allow you to do whatever you need to do.
How about Okta support?
So Okta uses OpenID Connect standard as well. We don't. So some of the service providers have like we talk about that little bit of nuance in how they handle the OpenID Connect standard. So I think something like AWS Cognito, one of them maybe uses form data versus JSON, and one of them might have a few headers that are different versus the other one. We haven't looked into the minor details of Okta, but essentially the answer is yes, it does work with Okta, barring a couple, perhaps minor tweaks, perhaps not even any tweaks. But we'll, in the coming days and weeks, we're going to be adding support for all these services. So it's pretty easy going. Luckily for us, the flow is pretty standardized at this point. So usually it's just a couple of details here and there that need to be tweaked to add support for a provider.
Another question, are we using the Auth0 SDK or Azure SDKs for these, or doing configuration swaps or like a custom solution? How's that kind of work under the hood?
Yeah, so no, that's a good question. And we don't use the Auth0 or Azure SDKs. And part of the reason this app even exists is because what was happening is we were seeing customers coming in who were using these SDKs, and things would happen like they'd be switching from one provider to another, or a lot of the service providers, everyone's very busy. They put out a sort of Cordova plugin or something to try to make it able for people to use, but maybe it doesn't get maintained and stay up to date as much as it should with all the varying security best practices for iOS or Android, right? And so what we realized was that, and also the thing about those SDKs is they have slightly different APIs, right? The Active Directory API is going to be different from Auth0, and they're going to have hard-coded URLs in each one relating to what their domains look like, whereas they're all using this OpenID Connect standard under the hood. So what we were able to do is basically generalize on the OpenID Connect standard so that your API, whether you're using Auth0, Azure Active Directory, AWS, it doesn't really matter. You get the same API, and so the only thing you have to swap under the hood is some of the things like the client ID, your redirect URIs, minor details like that that are really specific to the provider configuration, but then the app's going to function identically. So we stayed away from using any of those vendor-specific libraries to implement this because we want it to be, we don't want to lock you into any vendor. If you want to switch from Azure to AWS one day, we don't want you to have to rewrite your entire app in order to do that.
Yeah, as well as I believe adding more cross-platform like web support and other things, just keeping that tightly coupled Ionic experience. I think just being kind of in control of that and providing a great developer and user experience. Let's see, if I'm using Firebase, can I use Storage Vault?
Yeah, so I think you're referring to the identity vault we were talking about for secure storage. So if you're using Firebase, Firebase provides a number of different services. Those are all going to be sort of backend specific services. The secure storage is meant to be on-device storage for storing things like tokens or access keys. You can store sort of whatever data you want in there, but it's going to be basically a client-side storage device. So there's really no reason you can't I mean, you can absolutely use Firebase, and I think we probably have customers who use Firebase and our secure storage.
Oh yeah.
Maybe they're storing, tokens, login access for Firebase. Maybe they're storing,
Maybe
snippets of data or
PII or something. Yeah.
But that's absolutely compatible with anything you need to do. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's see. How does Identity Vault securely encrypt the JWT? Is there any kind of encryption, decryption of the token? Does the user have to provide any of that? I believe the answer is it's all handled for you, right?
Yeah. So as far as the JWT goes, right, that's going to be on your service provider's end. So if you're using something like Auth0, Microsoft Active Directory, that's all going to be handled on that side, and you're going to get back a JWT that's signed and encoded. And basically, the Identity Vault is really what it does is it takes that JWT, which can be used to essentially, authenticate against an API, so you can get your, directory of employees or authenticate against those systems, and you're just going to encrypt that and store it on the system. So that kind of encryption is actually AES 256 encryption, and so we use the keychain, which basically the iOS keychain, which is you've probably worked with before if you're on Mac. Android also has their own version of the keychain. The keychain helps you to generate these encryption certificates and then basically encrypt and decrypt the data. And the keychain stores it securely, like in iOS, they have a secure enclave so that essentially the keys never make it out into like a world where someone, a potential attacker could get them vulnerable. They're generated and stored securely in this enclave where they're meant to be used, and then your data is just sent in there, encrypted and stored away, and then decrypted. And we use built-in iOS functionality like biometrics, which is integrated with the keychain, so that we can authenticate your user on device when they're trying to access it. So there's sort of a distinction between the two sides, right? So the JWT encryption is going to be more of your authentication service provider, whereas Identity Vault is really just going to be about encrypting and storing that on your device.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
Makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I know I was personally, when we were kind of putting these products out here, just seeing just all the complexity and just the user experience and other things that go into, especially on mobile, all the edge cases, use cases that companies have to think through and potentially re-implement themselves. It's honestly, it's just kind of mind-blowing. And of course the work that Apple and Google go into making sure those are secure is being able to tap into that is really important. Okay, let's see. Let's see. Oh, good question touching on Azure Active Directory integration with Ionic projects. So that was what I had showed just now in the demo, but anything to touch on there, Nick, in terms of Active Directory? I believe it's support for AD 2.0, or just, so any more details on that?
Yeah, so, well, one, I think Active Directory, the Azure, they're kind of moving from their 1.0 to 2.0, but actually I think both 1.0 and 2.0 you're able to access and get your tokens using OpenID Connect protocol. So they would end up both being supported. I think the recommended, if you're starting up a new instance of Azure, you're going to end up with a Active Directory 2.0 instance in their Microsoft Cloud. But yeah, it'll integrate with any of those. We see that's a very common use case among our customers is working with that. So
yeah, nice. Okay, someone asking about us uploading and recording the webinar. So that's something we always do, is we email it out to you within a day or so of the, after finishing the presentation today, as well as post it online. So yes, that'll, for anyone that had to jump early, we of course will get that out to you. And yeah, and of course, let's see. Oh, is this available now? That's yes, it is.
They're both available now. So feel free to get in contact with us and we can get you set up. There was another question here I wanted to touch on. I don't think we jumped into, but I see someone asking about the existing Cordova secure storage plugin.
Okay.
And so I just wanted to go into a little bit of the differences between a secure storage plugin and Identity Vault, right? So on the surface level, you can actually, so I would say that the, Identity Vault is like a superset of the secure storage plugin, right? Secure storage plugin is similarly going to do the secure storage part of the Identity Vault plugin, where it's going to basically encrypt your data. It's going to store it securely on the device. I think that plugin is reasonably well maintained. Some plugins out there are more or less maintained. So Identity Vault, they're going to have a similar functionality: key storage, encrypted value pairs. Where Identity Vault kind of takes it to the next level is that essentially what we tended to see is these really common workflows where people were using like secure storage, and then they were using like a fingerprint plugin, and they were kind of passing things between these disparate plugins to get the functionality, right? So if someone wanted to lock an encrypted token behind like a biometric fingerprint or Face ID prompt, they might use the the fingerprint plugin to get the fingerprint scanning, and then they might go to the secure storage plugin to actually get it. But the thing is, you're only securing it behind the JavaScript statement. So the nice part about the secure storage plugin is that it actually ties these at a deeply native level,
device
together.
level,
right?
Hardware, etc. Yeah.
So like the keychain itself has functionality on it, which says I can authenticate this stored key via biometric prompts, and that is what we use, so that you get like the iOS approved ways of storing this data versus storing it encrypted somewhere, but then also using a different plugin to sort of accomplish this like piecemeal together flow. It's really just an all-in-one flow that's going to promote like best security practices. So
all right, cool. All right, everyone, I believe that's all the time we have for today, but on behalf of the Ionic team, Nick here, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah.
And Rachel, thank you so much for attending our Ionic Identity Vault and Auth Connect webinar. So thank you and take care. Until next time.